The street where I last saw you still exists. Same maple trees, same wrought iron gate, only the faces have changed. When I left in 1944, I promised I'd return in one piece. But war doesn't give back what it takes. I came back 20 years later, not as the boy you kissed goodbye, but as a man carrying silence like a second skin. I swore I'd never set foot in that town again. But something pulled me back. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was still you. I stepped off the Greyhound in the fall of 1964. My duffel bag was light, one sweater, a medal I never wore, and a stack of letters I never sent. Home was no longer home. The streets had changed, but your street, Cypress Avenue, still felt like a memory with its eyes open. The number 328 stared back at me like a dare. The porch where you hugged me before I shipped out to Europe was smaller now, or maybe I was just older. I didn't knock. I stood across the street for an hour, maybe more, until a neighbor stepped out to sweep the sidewalk and said, "Aren't you the soldier who used to sit out here with Annie? Said you'd come back someday." I nodded. He looked down. She got married a long time ago. I didn't ask anything else. I turned and walked. No destination. I ended up at the bus stop on 9th and Main. Sat there until the sun went down, then the next day, then the one after. The bench became my home. People thought I was homeless. Maybe I was, but I wasn't lost, not exactly. I was waiting for a sign, for your voice, for the sound of a name I'd been carrying in my chest like a prayer. Then one day, a man with a notepad sat beside me, said he was a local journalist writing about forgotten lives, asked if I was here every day. I nodded again. I had nothing left to hide, or maybe too much. We talked for a week. I told him about Anzio, about the letters I wrote in mud-soaked trenches. I told him about you. I never saw the article he wrote, not at first, but a week later a lady brought me a newspaper. There I was, photo and all. "The veteran without an address," the headline read. I almost laughed. Then it happened. A letter, hand-delivered. One line, written in the handwriting I could recognize even in a storm. "If you still remember, come." 328 Cypress Ave. I've been waiting. My hands trembled. Because suddenly, the world had a direction again. If this story is already touching you the way it touched me as I lived it, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. I came back to Cincinnati in October 1964. It had been 20 years, but the city had aged faster than I had. The steel mills were quieter, the trains didn't howl the way they used to, but Cypress Avenue, your street, was untouched by time. The bricks still cracked in the same places, the same oak tree bent toward the streetlight, like it was listening. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, like I was afraid I might wake a ghost. The number 328 was still on the mailbox. That front porch, I could still see you there in your summer dress, barefoot, waving as I headed off to boot camp. I was 19, you were 17. We thought we were invincible. We thought love was enough. I stared at the house for a long time. I didn't have the courage to walk up the steps. Not then. Just stood there until a man from the house next door came out with his dog. He looked at me for a beat and said, "You're the one, the soldier, Annie's boy." I nodded. He looked down. "She moved out years ago, got married. Think her husband died a while back." That was it. No explanation, no soft landing, just those words. I didn't know how to react, didn't even ask where she lived now. My legs moved on their own. I walked for hours, ended up back at the bus stop on 9th, sat down on the bench like it belonged to me. I had nowhere else to go. For days, I didn't leave. I bought coffee with change, slept with my coat zipped to the chin. People passed by. They looked but never stopped. I didn't blame them. I wasn't dirty, just invisible. A man stuck between two lives. I wasn't ready to see you. I wasn't even sure I deserved to. But one morning, a woman sat beside me, grey coat, kind eyes. Said her name was Mrs. Lindstrom. asked if I was the veteran in the paper. "You're the one who waited for someone who never stopped waiting too long," she said. I didn't understand at first. Then she handed me an address, not yours, your sister's. I hesitated. But the next day, I knocked on a blue door on Maple Street. Zofia answered. Her hair was pinned back like yours used to be. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me and whispered, "God help me, I never thought I'd see you." She let me in. The place was warm, smelled like cinnamon and something old, like letters tucked in drawers. We sat in silence. Then she got up, brought out a small tin box wrapped in a scarf. "She never threw these away," she said, and handed it to me. I untied the scarf slowly. Inside, my letters, the ones I wrote from Anzio, from Naples, from the prisoner camp. She'd kept them all, still folded the way I had when I sealed them with hope. Some had dried petals inside. Some were smeared with blood or dirt. But she'd saved them, every word. "She married a kind man," Zofia said, "but she never hid those letters. They were her real husband, if I'm honest." She paused. "She has a daughter now. She's smart, gentle. Your smile." I froze. I didn't ask. I couldn't, but something in my chest twisted. A daughter. "She named her Tessa," Zofia added. "Close enough to yours, huh?" She smiled, soft. "She never stopped loving you. She just learned how to live around the empty space." I thanked her, couldn't say much more. I took the box, held it like it was sacred. That night I didn't sleep. I just read, letter by letter. I was 19 again. 21, 23, prisoner, survivor, still in love. That's when I knew I couldn't hide anymore. I went back to Cypress Avenue the next morning. Not to knock, just to stand, to remember, and maybe to be remembered. I didn't expect anything. But you stepped out the door. You didn't see me at first. But when you did, you didn't flinch. Didn't run. You just stood there. And in that moment, I knew something had survived. Not untouched, not perfect, but real. I turned and walked away. I needed one more day, one more breath, and that's when the letter came. "Come tomorrow," it said. "If you're still the man who stood at that corner and promised to return, I'll be at the park bench." Noon. I didn't sleep that night either. But for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't afraid of the morning. When I boarded that ship in 1944, bound for Europe, I wasn't thinking about glory or medals or how history would remember men like me. I was thinking about your hands, about the way you laced your fingers through mine on the porch steps the night before I left, about the curve of your smile that told me everything would be okay, even when I knew it wouldn't. The battlefield is nothing like they tell you in stories or recruitment posters. It doesn't smell like gunpowder and courage, but like mud, sweat, burning hair, and fear so thick it coats your throat and lingers even after the silence sets in again, waiting for the next explosion to erase another name you once called friend. I wrote to you every day, though most of those letters never left my hands. Some were scratched onto the backs of ration slips, others on fragments of discarded maps, and one, I remember clearly, was written on the inside of a cigarette carton when all the paper had already turned to ash or blood. It didn't matter what I wrote on, only that I kept writing, because in a world where nothing felt real, your name on the page was the only proof I was still human. In Anzio, I learned how fragile men really are, not just their bodies, which break and bleed and fall under fire like leaves from a tree in late October, but their minds too, their memories, the soft parts inside that keep them tethered to who they used to be. I buried Wally there, my best friend from Kentucky, a man with a crooked smile and a laugh that used to echo down the trench long after. Everyone else had gone quiet, and when he was hit, it wasn't like in the movies. There was no hero's moment, just a flash, a sound like the air being torn in half, and then he was slumped against the dirt wall, eyes wide open, staring at something far beyond the war. That night I didn't sleep. I sat up with your photo in my lap, the one where you're standing in front of the old school, sunlight in your hair, holding a book like you were born to teach the world how to be kind. I wrote to you again, And this time I begged, not for rescue, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to keep waking up the next day, even when everything around me was dying. Then came the blast. A shell hit close, too close, and when I opened my eyes, there was dust, smoke, my leg on fire, and a medic yelling something I couldn't hear through the ringing in my skull. I remember gripping my helmet like it might hold my soul in place, and then the pain faded, replaced by nothing, a quiet so deep it felt like falling underwater with your lungs full of stones. I woke up in a German POW camp, my uniform stained with blood. I wasn't sure was mine, my boots gone, my identity stripped down to a number stitched into the grey fabric they gave me. We weren't soldiers anymore, not to them. We were ghosts, waiting to vanish. There were no mirrors in that place, just walls and barbed wire and men who stopped speaking, stopped dreaming, stopped believing in anything but cold and hunger. But I still had your letters, or the ones I remembered by heart. And every night when the others slept, I'd close my eyes and recite them in my head like a sermon. Dearest Annie, today was quieter. I saw a bluebird this morning and thought of your voice. If I make it through, I'll take you to see the ocean. I whispered your name into my palms, pressed them to my face, and imagined the warmth of your breath against my skin, and that became my shelter, my private chapel where nothing German, nothing broken, nothing ruined could reach me. 3 years. That's how long I stayed in that place, or rather, how long that place stayed inside me. When liberation came, it wasn't the flags or cheers or chocolate bars from American GIs that made me cry, but the fact that I could look at the sky again and believe it was mine. I came home, but not to you, not yet, because I didn't feel like I had the right. I was thinner, harder, quieter, and though my body was mostly healed, the parts of me that knew how to love, how to be loved, were still buried somewhere in that cold European earth, and I didn't know how to dig them back out. I wandered for years, through states and train stations, bus stops and shelters, carrying your photograph like a compass, folding and unfolding it until the corners tore and the creases blurred your face into something I had to memorize all over again, each time I opened it. I told myself I'd come back when I deserved to, when I could stand in front of you and not flinch from the reflection in your eyes, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that the man you waited for no longer existed, and that you wouldn't recognize what was left. But I kept walking, kept searching, because you had become the only thing in my world that hadn't burned, broken, or betrayed me. You were the light at the center of every blackout, the memory that refused to fade even when I begged it to. And now that I've seen your handwriting again, now that your name lives not just in my head, but in ink, on paper, on a page written with trembling hands, I know I didn't survive that war just for me. I survived it for you. When Zofia opened the door that second time, she didn't speak right away, nor did she step aside with the kind of formality that suggests you're welcoming a stranger. Instead, she simply looked at me with those calm, observant eyes that I remembered from long ago, and with a slight motion of her hand, she invited me into a house that didn't just hold furniture and fading photographs, but time it. Self, preserved in the dust on shelves and the scent of lemon wood polish clinging to the walls. The living room was quiet, filled with the softness that comes only from years of unspoken things. Every frame photo slightly tilted, every armchair worn just right, every detail whispering that this was a home shaped by loss, by resilience, by years of waiting for people who didn't always return. She led me to the kitchen, where the table was already set for tea, 2 mugs already steeping, as if she had known I would come. And maybe deep down she had. Maybe some part of her had never stopped expecting that the ghost from her sister's past might one day knock again. We sat down, and for a few minutes, the only sound was the gentle creak of the heating pipes and the distant hum of traffic outside, until she reached into the side drawer near the sink and pulled out a shoebox, wrapped in a scarf, so faded it looked like it might unravel if touched too quickly, and with the kind of reverence I'd once reserved for sacred things. She placed it on the table between us. Essen said, "She kept everything." When I opened the box, I wasn't prepared, not for the handwriting I barely recognized as my own, not for the folds and creases and smudged ink, not for the petals tucked between pages or the dried dirt still clinging to the edges of one envelope from the day it rained in Anzio. And I wrote by candlelight in a bombed-out church. I had written those words to survive, to breathe, and now here they were, still alive. "She never stopped reading them," Zofia said, her voice steady but distant, like she was speaking from the other side of a long-held truth. "Even after she married, even after the world told her to forget, she read them every month. Said they were her way of remembering who she used to be." I couldn't look at her. I stared at the letters, at the box, at the memories contained inside paper, and when she stood and walked over to the cabinet above the sink, retrieving a small framed photo and setting it gently beside the box, my breath caught in my throat. In the photo, Annie was younger than I remembered, not the girl I left and not yet the woman I'd almost recognized on that park bench. Sitting in a garden with a little girl on her lap, the child's hair tied back in ribbons, smiling wide with that fearless expression only children know how to wear, and while Annie's eyes held warmth and age and something deep, it was the girl's eyes that struck her. Me silent, because they weren't Annie's eyes. They were mine. Zofia didn't need to explain, not really, but she did anyway. Slowly, carefully, with the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, never sure it would happen. After the telegram came, the one saying your unit had been lost overseas, Annie didn't speak for almost a week, she began. She stayed in bed, stared at the ceiling, and when she finally got up, she told me about the baby. She was scared, not of the child, but of what it meant to raise her alone, in that time, in this town, with a father declared dead and no husband in sight. She told me how Annie had been sent to stay with an aunt in West Virginia for the rest of the pregnancy, how she gave birth quietly, surrounded by strangers, and how she returned months later, quieter than ever, but with a strength Zofia said she hadn't seen before or since. She told the world she'd adopted Tessa, Zofia continued, not looking at me. When she married Mark, he accepted it, never asked questions. He was kind, good, but Annie never stopped looking out the window every time a letter arrived, never stopped folding your picture and placing it under her pillow. I was holding the photo now, my fingers trembling slightly, trying to absorb the impossible. That while I had wandered from state to state, haunted by dreams and regrets, there had been a child, a daughter, growing up with my eyes and my blood and my absence. "She looks like you when she sleeps," Zofia said, softer now. "She doesn't know the truth, not yet, but she's starting to ask questions." I didn't know what to say, so I asked the only thing I could. "Why tell me now?" She looked up at me, her expression firm but kind. "Because Annie never stopped loving you. Because you deserve to know. And because Tessa deserves to know too, someday, on her own terms." As I stood to leave, heart heavy but somehow steadier than before, Zofia handed me a sealed envelope, thin, fragile, like it had waited too long to be opened. "She wrote it years ago," she said I should give it to you, only if you ever came back. I opened it on the bench where I had spent so many days hiding from the world, and inside, in the handwriting that still felt like home, were just 9 words. "I kept you alive. Will you do the same?" I folded the letter, placed it back in my coat, and for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of something I thought I'd lost forever. The truth, carried quietly, patiently, and with love. "You were already there when I arrived, sitting on the same park bench where we used to meet before the war, back when the world still made sense, and the future felt like something we could hold in our hands. And from a distance, I wasn't sure if I was seeing a memory or a miracle, because there you were, in that grey coat you always wore in autumn, your hands folded neatly in your lap, your gaze fixed on something in the trees above, as if you were listening to time itself whisper its secrets. I stood still for a while, afraid that moving might break the spell, that approaching you would wake me from the dream I had carried for 20 years. But then you turned your head, slowly, gently, and saw me. And in that single look, there was no anger, no surprise, no pain, only recognition, like I'd been gone a season, not a lifetime. I walked toward you, heart pounding harder than it ever had under fire, and when I finally stood in front of you, you didn't speak. Instead, you reached out your hand, and I took it, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, so I did neither. Just sat down beside you, where I had always belonged. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of things we had carried separately, things too heavy to name. But eventually, you broke it with a voice that still carried every note I remembered, though it was softer now, tinged with something wiser, deeper. "You really came back," you said, not as a question, but as a quiet affirmation of something you'd never stopped believing. "I did," I replied, though not the same. You looked at me, really looked, and then smiled in that slow, knowing way that used to undo me when we were kids. "Neither am I," you said, "but some parts stayed." Oh, we sat there as the afternoon light turned golden, watching children run past, the wind scattering leaves around our feet, and you told me how life had moved without me, how you had married Mark, a man who was kind and steady, who never asked too many questions, who gave you safety when the world didn't. And I listened, not with jealousy or regret, but with a quiet reverence for the version of you that had survived without me. When you spoke about Tessa, your eyes changed, softened in a way that I recognized, the way they used to soften when we lay under the stars and talked about names for children we thought we'd one day raise. And I asked if she knew, and you nodded slowly, your fingers tightening slightly around mine. "She found the letters last year," you said. "I'd kept them hidden for so long I forgot where I'd put them. But she's clever. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me a little differently." You paused. "And then one day, she asked me if the man from the letters was you. I didn't lie. I just cried. For the first time in years." I closed my eyes. "Does she hate me?" You shook your head. "She doesn't hate you. She wants to meet you, not as her father, not right away, but as the man who gave her something she never had a name for." That's when I reached into my coat and handed you the envelope Zofia had given me, the one you wrote 10 years ago, and as you opened it, your hands trembled slightly, but your face remained calm, and when your eyes scanned the single sentence you had once penned in a moment of fragile hope, I saw tears. Real, quiet, unashamed. "I kept you alive. Will you do the same?" You folded the letter back and tucked it into your bag, like it had always belonged there. And then, with a voice that shook more than I expected, you said, "I think we both did the best we could, with the time we were given." The sun dipped lower behind the trees. The shadows stretched across the path. The air smelled of wood smoke and rain. And then you stood, brushed the leaves from your coat, and asked the question I had never dared imagine you would. "Would you like to walk me home?" I didn't answer right away. I stood, took your arm in mine, and we started walking slowly, without rush, as if the years between us weren't years at all, but pauses in a sentence we were finally ready to finish. We passed the bookstore on Main, the one where you used to buy paperbacks for $1, and I smiled as you pointed out the new awning, the chipped window frame, the sign you once painted with your own hands. When we reached your street, Cypress Avenue, the same as always, you stopped in front of the porch and looked up at the house, then turned to me. "She's inside," you said. "Would you want to come in, just for tea?" My throat tightened. I nodded. That's when the door opened, and for the first time in my life, I saw my daughter. Now we live 3 blocks apart, Not under the same roof, but close enough to hear the echo of the same birds in the morning. Close enough to walk the same path to the diner on Elm Street, where we meet every Saturday at 9 sharp, where you always order peppermint tea and I pretend I like the eggs, even though they always come out too runny. We don't speak of the war much, not anymore, not because we've forgotten, but because some things are better left in the quiet. And yet, in every glance across the table, in every hand brushed lightly across my sleeve when the waitress brings the check, there's a language deeper than memory, a kind of knowing that only comes from loss endured and love held against all odds. You kept the letters. I kept the photograph. Between the two of us, we carried something fragile for so long, and somehow it survived. Not unchanged, but intact. Tessa comes by on Sundays now. Sometimes she brings her dog, sometimes her notebooks filled with poetry. She refuses to read aloud. She doesn't call me Dad. She doesn't have to. She calls me Mr. Thomas, with a smile that breaks something gently inside me every time. We sit on the porch. We talk about books, about jazz, about her classes. She listens when I speak, really listens. And sometimes I catch her watching me, like she's memorizing the sound of my voice, like she's building something out of all the pieces we never had time to make whole. I don't try to make up for what I missed. You can't fill decades with teacups and conversation, but I show up every week, every word, and somehow that's enough. I've stopped sleeping at bus stops. I have a place now, small, with uneven floors and a view of nothing special, but it's mine. And on the wall above the desk there's a single frame. Your first letter, the one I never received, but you wrote anyway, tucked behind a photo of you holding our daughter in the garden. Some nights I still write. Not about the war, about this life, the second one, the one I never expected, but was given anyway. I write because the words finally have somewhere to go. And when I pass by the bench on 9th and Main, I don't sit anymore. I tip my hat, touch my coat pocket, where the last letter still lives, and I keep walking. Because now I'm no longer waiting for something lost. I'm moving towards something found. To those who've followed this story, thank you for listening, for holding space for a voice that for too long sat quietly on the edge of the world. I may not have returned whole, but I returned. And somehow that's enough. We share stories like this every day, real lives that move, reveal, and inspire. If this one touched you the way it touched me, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with someone who still believes in second chances.